Well, federal rules around quarantining for non-essential travelers returning to Canada has been in place for months now. But new data analysis by CBC News reveals that hundreds of private flights have been able to get around those. Katie Nicholson is reporting on this story and joins us now live from Toronto. Katie, let's talk about this. What does the numbers tell us in terms of how many private flights are coming into Canada?
This pandemic has obviously been very devastating for the aviation industry. Commercial flights have sort of been grounded, and the private aviation industry is also reeling from this, but it is continuing to fly. When those new quarantine hotel rules kicked in, we wanted to see how that particular industry was sort of navigating through this. So what we did is we just wanted to get a snapshot, a window in time. We went to the flight tracking company FlightAware and we asked for their data for 4 majors where all international traffic is being directed. And we also asked for just a random sampling of other airports across Canada to see if international travel is still happening, or that flights coming from international destinations are in fact landing in other Canadian airports. So, what we were able to find is that from February 22nd to April 26th, there were more than 800 private flights which landed in roughly 9 airports in Canada. And so when we're talking about private flights, we're talking about business aviation, we're talking about helicopters, we're also talking about privately owned leisure, small aircraft, that sort of thing, 6-seaters. And so that's sort of like what we're talking about when we say private aviation. The bulk of aviation right now in Canadian skies is business aviation. And then we also looked at how many flights are coming in to the 4 majors from private business, from private aviation. And that was more than 1,600, more than half of them coming into Toronto.
So, Katie, where are these flights coming from?
So let's look at the more than 800 private flights that came to Toronto during that window. The bulk of them, 256, came from Florida. We're seeing what was interesting is, not surprisingly, most of the flights are coming from the U.S. We're tied to the U.S. in so many ways. There is a lot of business travel, essential business travel happening across the border through this period. There are supplies, medical supplies coming in along these routes. But the other thing, too, that we sort of, caught our eye was a lot of sun destinations. So we're seeing a lot of flights like from Florida, from Arizona, and then more broadly internationally from Tahiti, from the Bahamas, from the Turks and Caicos, private flights coming into Canada. From those destinations, despite the non-essential federal, the federal non-essential travel advisory. So that sort of caught our eye. But we also spoke with the head of the Canadian Business Aviation Association. And he said, just because you're seeing a lot of flights coming from sun destinations, that doesn't mean that these are scofflaws. That doesn't necessarily mean that these are people who are sort of vacationing. Here's Anthony Noreko.
So Florida is certainly a sunnier climate, but everything from the economy of Florida, how quickly businesses are moving. And so this also translates to Canadian businesses. These are environments that are favorable. Perhaps they've got enterprise there. Perhaps they're looking to expand. Miami's a great area right now from a tech sector. So there's a lot of reasons why somebody would go to a quote unquote sunshine state.
And we also spoke with an infectious diseases expert, just looking at this, seeing places like Grand Cayman and Tahiti represented in this data. This is Dr. Leanne Parks and her reaction to the idea that perhaps people are traveling to these sun destinations for leisure.
I feel deep in my soul the urge to travel because I loved it. But I also feel like it is not responsible at a level of infection prevention and control to do so. I do think that there is a moral responsibility to protect these locations, and particularly locations that might not have the resources available to combat a massive outbreak that might occur there.
So that is Dr. Leanne Parks, an infectious diseases doctor in Montreal.
Okay, this would seem to go against the federal government's travel policy. What's the response to all of this, Katie?
Well, if people are traveling for leisure, the federal government came back to us yesterday and said, we strongly advise Canadians to postpone these types of trips. The business aviation sector has said, it's not up to us to decide when we're contracted, whether something is for leisure or a legitimate business purpose. But the federal government says, there are a number of reasons as well that you might see flights landing at the other airports other than the four majors. They include crew repatriation. Maybe it's you're repositioning a flight. Maybe it's an empty flight that's going to pick somebody up. It could be a technical stop. You're gassing up or there's an emergency. So there is a lot of wiggle room within the within the NOTAM, which basically is directing the notice to airmen to the four major airports. And the other thing that the federal government really wanted to hit home is that even if you are landing in the other airports of entry, you are still expected to take the federal COVID tests. You are still expected to meet with a quarantine officer and have a valid quarantine plan. You are expected to be able to follow all of the rules for the jurisdiction in which you're landing. Just one thing to note, there is a major exception to this notice to airmen. That is that privately owned recreational aircraft, those smaller aircraft for leisure purposes, which we have tracked going across the border, they are exempt from the rule which requires you to go to the four major airports. John?
Thanks for this, Katie. Katie Nicholson.
You're welcome.
In Toronto.